Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I hope you're all riding the caffeine wave following the postprandial slump. And I'm going to rely on that because I must confess that I've scripted my talk today. I'm so tired from starting a new job that my cognitive functions are so impaired. I didn't trust myself to put full sentences together on the hoof. So I hope you'll bear with me. I also wanted to keep my PowerPoint very light. So at least for that, you might be grateful. So today I'm going to talk about how we might want to try and conceptualize personal tutoring more securely within a pedagogic framework. And really, this is very much early thinking for me about how we might want to do this. I absolutely don't have all the answers. I'm really just getting started on trying to think this through. I'm basing this talk on findings from the RARA project as it played out in the Dental Institute at King's, which is where I was, as Sam said, college senior tutor until 5 weeks ago. Not that I'm counting. So it's worth starting by noting that, and others have said this, but it's worth repeating, doing personal tutoring is normal in the UK higher education sector. In the vast majority of universities, personal tutoring is a mainstream academic and pastoral support provision for taught students, less so for research students. Imposed at course level and delivered by most teaching active academic staff. Certainly in all the Russell groups, they still all do personal tutoring. Many universities, including those involved with RARA, recognise, I think, that personal tutoring should be a mainstream offering, that in order to be inclusive and to ensure that all students are able to engage with their teachers, that it needs to be part of the fabric of the educational provision and not an optional extra. And that was one of the principles which Sam flagged up early in the talk. But what are the persistent problems we all recognise with it, and how might we try and work through some of those towards perhaps solving some of them? I'm going to try and strip things back to some essential points, really. Now, firstly, it's felt to be an onerous and stressful task. I think most of us probably noticed when the awful death of Malcolm Anderson at Cardiff University was reported recently that he kept referring to his role as a personal tutor. I don't know if you picked that up. I suppose I'm primed to see it, really. The reasons he was thought to have taken his own life were reported to be due to an unreasonable volume of work, but also the fact that, quote, he spent many hours with his personal tutees who would email him day and night. And I think, as others have said, in many cases, academic staff do not feel that personal tutoring is within their professional skill set. Attempts institutionally to define what pastoral care, what personalised academic support should be, are rarely successful, I think. Also, staff know that personal tutoring activities are not factored into workload planning or reward and recognition pathways. I would say, provocatively, being a good personal tutor is a promotion killer. Subsequently, personal tutoring is often seen as nebulous student support. It's fourth in priority after research, teaching, other administration, being chair of the exam board, for example, admissions tutor. When staff do engage, they're told it requires extra special training, often featuring presentations from student services about how to deal with psychological and social problems that might arise in a personal tutoring conversation. All of this feeds into the insecurity, as Emma said, of frustrations of teaching staff who already feel that such things are outside of their frame of reference, and therefore they might avoid personal tutoring encounters for fear of what might have to be discussed. From the student side, they recognise that variation in personal tutoring practice, even at course level, is prolific, and rightly they feel aggrieved when their friend has a great personal tutor but they are allocated a dud. This comes up all the time in NSS comments. They also note how frequently they see their tutors as busy, stressed, overworked, and so don't want to bother them. I was struck this year by the anonymous academic column in The Guardian, which had a student contribution in May, who said, quote, today's students are likely to wonder whether their professor could pick them out of a lineup. To that I would add, that's even if their professor is in the country, when in fact most classroom teaching is undertaken by precariously employed staff on 9-month contracts or graduate students. Now, the recent strikes actually gave me a lot of pause for thought about how we're conceptualising teaching, how we're rewarding it, and how we're thinking about personal tutoring within that. So I think this is probably where some of this thinking that I'm going to present today comes from. I'd also say that one thing that really struck me when I was senior tutor at King's for 4 years was I was constantly contacted by other universities, some of whom are here today, with the starting phrase, "We are reviewing our personal tutoring system." It seems to be a Sisyphean task. I left King's as they were reviewing their personal tutoring system, 3 years after we'd done it. And you have to wonder, is it genuinely a pointless round of sort of, questions that can't be answered? They always ask the same things. How can we train staff? How many tutees is the right number? How do we assure quality? How do we evaluate effectiveness? On the meta-inquiries too, are these the right questions? Is personal tutoring even compatible with massification of higher education? As the anonymous academic column highlights, work intensification is a very real concern in higher education. It's so real that you do wonder if personal tutoring is an anachronism, a nostalgic throwback to a time when universities were not perpetually growing student numbers and deploying sometimes blunt quantitative instruments to try and capture evidence of teaching and research quality. Having said all of that, universities teachers do know, I think, that teaching involves engaging with people, we would hope, often young people, and that this relationship should not be purely transactional. Increasingly, I would also say that teachers recognise how hard it is to be a student in 2018, and so do understand why students seem to present more and more frequently with their personal difficulties, and that these things make their way into tutorials, not just personal tutorials, into classroom teaching and onto the essay script. It's not just about personal tutoring where these things come up. Most teachers, I think, would also say that it's reasonable to accept that students want to be singled out of a lineup, that they want to talk to their tutors, and that they want to talk about how they're engaging with their studies and with their course more generally, and to look at their progress. In fact, when I asked 60 or so senior tutors at King's in October last year, who should students talk to about their academic progress, all but one of them said academics. So if most teaching academics agree on these things, then we might propose it is essential that all teachers have some capability in talking to individual students about some personal issues that are relevant to academic engagement and progress. Personal sensitive issues do not only arise in personal tutorials. I need to say that 20 times, I think. When I was teaching at King's, I would say it happened almost as commonly in the classroom as it did in the personal tutor encounter afterwards, as you're walking out the corridor, as you're arriving early and they're there when you arrive. So most universities also do not have the luxury of asking how many tutees is the right number. We might provocatively say, you know what, the right number is 2, because nobody could really cope with more than that. But there's no point in saying that if we cannot allocate just 2 people. So thinking pragmatically, we might also start to think that the personal tutoring encounter itself needs to be far more carefully defined and boundaried to work within existing staff capabilities so that it can be structured on a scale that is both deliverable and therefore equitable. So what do we do? I want to propose that one thing we might do is try and decisively take personal tutoring out of a poorly defined pastoral or other academic framework, and instead reconceptualise it firmly within a pedagogic framework that, as Mark Lowenstein has suggested for academic advising in the US, that personal tutoring is teaching. I'm making this proposal based on some findings from the RARA project, but also because I just feel strongly that if we want academic staff to engage with it, and we want them to be appropriately trained, that we need to factor it into basic academic practice training and not have it as outside of that, as extra, as additional. I'm also going to suggest that we might even think about personal tutoring as dialogic learning, and that the idea of dialogic learning might be a foundation upon which we build other capabilities for teaching academics too. Now, of course, there will be a consequence to this, in that reconceptualising personal tutoring along pedagogic lines also means defining what it can't and shouldn't do. And in doing so, we will expose gaps in academic support-related provision which are currently shouldered by personal tutoring systems. These sorts of things probably sit in a hinterland between specialist student support and academic support, sort of academic-related support, we might call it, and I'll say a little bit about that. But firstly, how did the RARA work lead me here? Well, at King's, the RARA project was undertaken in our dental institute, And in the Dental Institute, personal tutoring is overseen by an accessible dean who places a very strong emphasis, I think, on education and student support, by a very proactive senior tutor who's also director of welfare and a clinical teacher. We actually have one of our dental students here with us today. Rima, do you want to give a wave? So she will correct me if I'm wrong with this. Students are taught by busy part-time clinicians, but in small, stable teams, where they know their fellow students and their teachers pretty well. In line with King's policy, all students are allocated a personal tutor. However, what we learned was engagement with the system is not particularly strong for all students. Some said they only really considered talking to their personal tutor if they had a problem, but actually, even if that was the case, they wondered whether the best person to go to might actually be the dean or the senior tutor anyway, or even one of their clinical tutors who they saw more regularly. So while some of the DI students did talk passionately about great tutors, overall the cohort attitude towards personal tutoring was more or less indifferent, actually. The one thing they did think personal tutoring might provide was support with career planning, or in fact they might learn from the experiences of their personal tutors, all of whom are dentists, and that might be an enrichment or an enhancement to the offering at the moment. So it's a sort of benign indifference, really. And what struck me about these findings was how personal tutoring wasn't the one access point through which a student felt that they could engage personally with their teachers. What we might call the pastoral was embedded in management organisation and in curriculum design. Now, having been a personal tutor myself in a humanities department and in the medical faculty at King's, and as the university's senior tutor, I can say confidently that this is not the norm for all departments. The norm is that personal tutoring and individual personal tutors bear the burden for pastoral care. It and they take the weight, precisely because the burden or responsibility is not shared in other parts of the department, in course management structures or in curriculum design. It's pushed onto the personal tutor system. Personal tutors are often the first point of contact when something course-related impacts on the student, be that something sensitive or practical. It's not just about mental health difficulties or personal or social problems. It's also really practical difficulties. I got allocated the wrong module. My timetable doesn't work. Talk to your personal tutor is very often a convenient handoff in universities. So maybe this gets us to the heart of the personal tutoring conundrum. As an intervention, it's often conceptualised functionally to provide the pastoral responsibilities and the individualisation of students that other elements of teaching or academic support do not. And yet personal tutoring alone cannot cope with bearing all of this weight. And perhaps that's why it's failing. So how might reconceptualising it as dialogic learning make any difference? Sounds very abstract because it is. And what does it mean? So just to take the second of these questions first, put very simply, dialogic learning recognises the value of talking within an educational setting in generating meaning. Put my teeth in. It's influenced by Mikhail Bakhtin's philosophy of language. Those of you that did an English literature degree will be familiar with Bakhtin. And the dialogic imperative is that meaning, or we might say learning in this context, happens when ideas are placed into an imaginative and discursive space. And where this space provides an opportunity for meaning to be challenged and regenerated. So Rupert Wegeriff would say that learning to think is about being drawn into dialogues. The talking develops the thinking capabilities. More concretely, perhaps, Mark Tennant has said that dialogic learning could be where the teacher acts as a commentator or decoder who challenges and opens up alternative readings of experience. So I think this idea will be familiar to some educators who teach subjects via seminar or tutorial, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, where these are seen as fundamental to the learning experience. And if as educators we agree that students through dialogue might learn to think not just about specific topics and subjects through talking, but might learn to think about themselves in relation to these things through talking too, then we start to think about how learning talk might be the baseline on which we sit personal tutoring. If we see it through a sort of dialogic lens, then the personal tutor encounter is not necessarily about switching out of teaching mode into student support mode. It would be an encounter led by a teacher who's, we would hope, already skilled in dialogic practice, simply switching gears so that the focus is on the student and their engagement with their learning, not just on the disciplinary subject themselves. The priority here is to make the space, provide the opportunity for the learning talk to happen, and that would be the structure that is personal tutoring. So this really is pretty abstract, I do see that. However, if we can try and make a case to see personal tutoring like this, as dialogic learning, as teaching, I do think we could start to structure our support for academic practice more concretely into recruitment, into training and reward. It is possible for some universities to define their educational provision around an idea like this. Now, don't shoot me, but Oxford does this. Now, not all universities can or would want to be like that, but they do say quite boldly, this is how we do it, and that's our standard, and everything sort of works around it. And I think other universities could be equally as bold in at least defining what education means for them. They could say that education for us is personal and is dialogic, and that's your starting point, upon which you start to build other aspects of academic practice. I think it's also possible to think about how we conceptualise the university and the department, for example, as areas where not just the personal tutor has a responsibility for pastoral support, but where all educators, all professional services roles have a role to play in providing support in all educational roles and spaces, thus establishing a broader structure of pastoral care and avoiding placing all emphasis on personal tutoring. You might start to think about how teachers can be educated in dialogic practice as part of their essential classroom training, that learning talk is the foundation upon other things such as interactive lecturing, bench or bedside teaching. So additionally, and as importantly, by defining personal tutoring as teaching, we might also start to make a more successful case for the elements that the personal tutor encounter can't pick up and needs additional professional support for, in keeping with this idea of a broader pastoral structure. So this is about having access to specialist services, but it's not just about that. I think as a sector we are better educated in the idea of signposting students to specialist services. We know how to say, I want to help, so I'm going to suggest that you make an appointment with that service. In other words, the teacher acknowledges the problem and signifies the desire to help by handing it on. And that's quoting Nicola Byram's work there. But this is only a part of it. When I was a personal tutor, I would say it was the compound effect of multiple lower-level practical problems that would make the personal tutor encounter stressful and overwhelming. The student would be distressed by 20 things that have gone wrong, often practical. And in the 15-minute meeting, you find yourself as a good tutor, a diligent tutor, with a long to-do list generated. I'll look into that for you. Let me see what's happened there. Let me work out who it is that can fix that for you. You end up with this long list. And if you multiply that by 30, 3 times a year, on top of which you think about tutors worrying about the mental health of their students, then you start to see how these systems where all the emphasis for pastoral care is placed on them are creaking. So if we try and reconceptualise personal tutoring as learning talk, where that learning talk might be framed around providing a student with the space to think across and above their modules in order to generate meaning about their academic progress, it's not just the specialist and sensitive issues that need support. What students also require are accessible support for lower-level practical concerns. If they need MIT-Circs to change modules, make an inquiry about assessments, complain about course provision, these things should not be pushed through the personal tutor system, but should be shouldered by programme or academic support officers, by module tutors, programme directors, all of whom are responsible for listening to and resolving the issues. It's in their role, it's in their job description. You have a pastoral duty and responsibility too. Often these people do these things, but actually they also think that they're supposed to say, go talk to your personal tutor. So if we understand that pastoral support is a collective endeavour provided by all staff who encounter students, then we start to see how we might be taking some pressure off the personal tutor system. And lastly, I want to champion the role of the senior tutor in setting the tone and creating the norms for reconceptualising personal tutoring as teaching. So I'm really glad that Emma brought this up in her talk. And naturally, I am hugely biased in this regard because this is what I did for 4 years. And actually working with the senior tutors at King's over that time was hugely rewarding, and they were wonderful in their roles. So observed from the RARA project, in the Dental Institute, a very proactive, visible, teaching active senior tutor with time specifically brought out for that role can lead from the front. They can pick up complex cases that individual personal tutors cannot manage. They can support staff to learn how to hand on concerns and boundary practice as senior tutors, as personal tutors. I think critically the senior tutor doesn't just do, they also signify that a faculty or a school's pastoral support and norms belong with everybody. And if they are part of the teaching staff, then they can also think about how pastoral care is embedded into all aspects of provision, be it curriculum design or management structures. So I think if universities want students to feel individualised and personally supported, then it is time to think about how we conceptualise, position and support personal tutoring. And I think really we might need to start stripping it right back. In an ideal world, the dialogic encounter that is the personal tutorial would offer the space and time for a student to learn how to talk about how they personally are engaging with the discipline and with the university, and to consider what that means for their academic progress and for their future, without this conversation being crowded out by practical discussions and issues that need solving, and personal, sensitive issues that tutors are terrified and ill-equipped to deal with. It doesn't mean they won't come into the space, but if you have the support around them that they can be shared with others, it doesn't have to be the only thing that's discussed. And if we can define this more securely along pedagogic lines, then we might create the space to offer students quite powerful opportunities to build metacognitive and dialogic capabilities that are an extension and an enhancement to their disciplinary learning. We all need to learn how to talk competently about ourselves with others to be successful, functioning people in jobs and in the world. So it's part of their education. I think it could also be a really bold way of emphasising our view of what it means to be a university teacher, that it should and can be transformational on a personal level in all educational spaces for students. So the dialogic framework may not be the best or the only approach to reconceptualising personal tutoring. It's my first attempt to have a go with this. So in the spirit of Bakhtin, who said, if an answer does not give rise to a new question, it falls out of the dialogue, then I hope it serves at least as a useful conversation starter. Thank you.